I actually wasn't sure what I was going to say. I thought I would listen to what everyone talked about and kind of riff off a concept. And the concept first is to thank everyone involved with When Words Collide, because I think Stacy said this in her introductions to the readings that we had done, that what writers do is magic. And I'll take that a little bit further. I would say that what writers and readers do together is magic, and that's what makes When Words Collide magic. And thank you to Randy and all the volunteers for giving us the opportunity to come together and celebrate that magic. And that is why I keep returning to this conference. Rob Sawyer said to me my first time I came here 4 years ago, he said, "This is the only conference that I come to on my own dime every year because I think it's one of the best literary conferences everywhere." And Rob goes to dozens and dozens of countries to conferences, and that speaks a lot of it. And I thought Rob was like bullshitting, like, because he's like, Rob's a nice guy, he says nice things about people he knows and things, and I'm thinking that's just exaggeration. And I was probably like Chris, I was probably, not even halfway through the conference, and I went, oh my God, he's right, this is awesome. And I registered immediately to come back the next year, because it's the people here who believe in writing, who believe in reading, who believe in bringing those together that makes that magic. I truly believe that there has never been a better time to be a writer. There's also never been a better time to be a reader. And that's part of the excitement and thrill that we have coming here. When I was little, from my earliest days, I can remember being in love with the concept of storytelling. I loved telling stories. I had my little Fisher-Price characters. I would sit on the floor. I was the only child. So the only friends I had was when they tied a pork chop to my neck and the dog would play with me. Or I had my little Fisher-Price characters, and I would sit there and I would tell stories. And the six figures I had were 40 different characters depending on what scene they were in. And I imagined different costumes in my head and all the things. And it wasn't just playing for a couple hours and telling stories, but I would actually have like this serialized story. And I would, it's bedtime now, so I would have to have a cliffhanger. And then I would come back to it. And for months, I would return to the same stories. But it wasn't until I discovered the permanence of putting words on a page that I or somebody else could come back to that became really magical for me. And that's when I just truly fell in love with words. My mom worked at the local mini-mart in a small town in northern Ontario where I grew up, and every Tuesday when the new comic books would come out, she would bring comic books home for me, and I devoured them like crazy. Richie Rich and Casper the Ghost and Spider-Man. Oh God, did I ever love Stan Lee's riff on "with great power comes great responsibility." And it's something I still continue to enjoy to this day. Had the distinct pleasure of re-enjoying Spider-Man in all the iterations that they've done in the movies with my son in the last few years. And obviously looking for those cameos for Stan Lee, because that's also always an important part of the Marvel universe. But when I went back to my earliest days, and I think I wanted to be a stuntman, like Colt Seaver for The Fall Guy, if you remember Lee Majors. I think I wrote down I wanted to be a stuntman. I wanted to be...
I did an episode of The Fall Guy.
Oh my God, I love you even more. God, see, I could have been Colt Seavers, and you could have been one of the guest stars on the show. And oh my God, that was. Oh, so you didn't think you could like Chris anymore, and then suddenly he's cooler than ever. It wasn't just the craft beer that you had me at craft beer yesterday, But I remember writing in that little yearbook that you kept for things you wanted to be when you grew up and who your best friends were. And I remember looking back at it, and I think it was grade 5. Was the first time that I wrote, I want to be a writer. And my parents gave me the best advice that they could come up with at the time when they learned I wanted to be a writer, and it was, well, you better get a really good job then so you can support yourself when you're being a writer. Because they believed in me, and they were very supportive that way. But it was practical advice, and it felt like a slap in the face when I got it, but it was very practical advice. I remember movies would come on TV, and there would be a writer was the main character in the movie, and he was bringing a box of Spam into his house, and my mom said, "See, that's what you'll eat all the time if you're a writer." And I said, "But it's a great Monty Python skit." So I remember selling short stories and making bits of money off those stories. I remember having published dozens and dozens of short stories because that was the way you could find an agent. That was the way you could get an editor interested in you, because you had slowly built your way up through the small press markets and into the larger markets, and then suddenly you could prove to an agent or an editor that you were worth looking at. And I got to a certain point, having been a bookseller for more than 25 years, where people would say, "So you're a writer?" And I would say, "Yeah, I'm a writer." And they would say, "Well, where can I find your writing?" And at the time, it was kind of challenging because I was only published in small press magazines and some of the larger magazines, but they were only out maybe at the most for, a month or a quarter, and then they would disappear, never to be found. So in 2004, I did something that all of my friends advised me against doing. I took the previously published short stories and I self-published them into a collection called One Hand Screaming. It was against the advice of every single writer I respected and admired. But they did write blurbs for me, ironically, even though they didn't believe in it. They said, "This is the best way to kill your career." And this was back, and I know self-publishing is more accepted today, but this was back in the day when you would be as likely to admit to self-publishing as you would be to be standing up here on stage and to say to everyone, "Hello everyone, my name is Mark Lefebvre, or Mark Leslie, and I masturbate." You would do it, you would self-publish, but you wouldn't admit to doing it. You wouldn't admit to vigorously going blind in the bathroom. "No, Dad, I'm just reading." I said it's never been a better time to be a writer or a reader. So this was using print-on-demand technology to make a book available, and it allowed me, because I set it up as returnable, having been a bookseller, I understood the industry enough. I made it returnable, so when I called a bookstore, when I called a Chapters, or I called a Barnes & Noble and said I was going to be in town in 3 months, could I do a signing? And they looked it up in their computer. They saw it was fully returnable, so they took a chance. And that's how I started to go and do some book signings. And that's when I pitched my first book. Like Sam said, I pitched it on an idea to Dundurn Publishing, and they bought it. And then I said, "Oh crap, I got to write it." Because the challenge was when I pitched this book of ghost stories about Hamilton, which I had learned Dundurn had always wanted to do a book of ghost stories about Hamilton, so that was a relatively easy pitch. Pitch what they want. They said, "This would be awesome. We could fit it in the fall catalog. Can you get it to us in 2 months?" And I went, "All right, I better take a week off work." And that's kind of how I've done every single nonfiction book with Dundurn. But I've found opportunities in publishing by being open-minded to the possibilities that exist, by looking at the business of publishing as a business and recognizing the niches that you could fill for a publisher, or when you're doing it yourself, recognizing that opportunities do exist. I make most of my income comes from Kobo, and that helps me live and get craft beer and pay the rent and all that. But for my writing income, half of my writing income comes from traditional publishing, and the other half comes from self-publishing. And about 90% of my print book sales come from traditional publishing, who have distribution and get my books into Costco, etc. And about 95% of my self-publishing income comes from ebooks. So that's interesting that embracing both of those has allowed me greater opportunities as a writer. And I look at how publishing has changed and how reading has changed. Back in the early days, reading was done by scroll makers. And only really, really rich people, or those elite people in society, had access to the written word. Yeah, back in the early days, storytelling was verbal, it was community, and it was writer and reader, or storyteller and listener sitting together. It slowly moved into that realm of only the rich could afford to read, and there weren't many scrolls to go around. Gutenberg changed that in a major way with movable type, and that suddenly allowed more people more access to reading than ever before. Publishers like Penguin made a significant difference when the introduction of the mass market paperback happened, because suddenly you didn't have to be rich. You didn't have to buy a hardcover in order to have access to a book. trade paperbacks were virtually, even when I started in bookselling, trade paperbacks were only for Oprah picks, basically. A trade paperback is a relative new phenomenon in publishing. There was hardcover, and then there was mass market, and then we have the trade paperback, which is a nice in-between, often done from the very same digital format, because it's pretty much the same size as a hardcover. And then in about 2006 or so, Sony introduced e-readers had been around for a long time, and it wasn't until Sony introduced the PSR 505 that was actually a workable, really great e-reading device. I remember Stephen King even experimenting with ebooks back in 1999, and it was still too early for most things. He even had free stuff he was making available, and it was still too early for digital in that manner. So Sony really made a significant difference, but it wasn't, of course, until the Kindle came out and the iPad that mobile reading really took off in a big way. And again, in the history of reading, never before did more readers than ever before have access to more books to read than ever before. And again, with the advent of digital publishing, it removed some of those gatekeepers. It removed some of those barriers. It allowed more people to make mistakes, like masturbating in public. And that does still happen with self-publishing. Sometimes books get released that aren't ready for prime time, and that's a mistake that we all can make. But the opportunity for writers has never been stronger. Writers have never had more choices, more options than ever in the history of publishing. And with the advent of the digital technologies that we have today, with the amazing creative people, with collaborations between agents and writers and editors and publishers and retailers and people we're not even sure who they are yet, who will be coming up, adding different technologies to the methods of storytelling will allow us to continue to enjoy this thing that we cherish, this thing that we love so much. I'm so excited when I think about the possibilities of storytelling. I use this app called Zombies Run. Is anyone familiar with this? Zombies Run is an app. It's based on GPS. And Naomi Alderman, and you may know Naomi Alderman because she co-wrote a story with Margaret Atwood about zombies. And Naomi Alderman created this story where it's the zombie apocalypse, you're runner number 5, and you're listening to people who are sending you on running missions. And it actually uses the GPS to track where you're going. And you're on these fake missions, and they're telling you to go certain places, but you're just running whatever route you're running. But the beautiful thing about this app isn't just the great stories and the characters and the voices, and it's like a brilliant radio play that you're listening to between your own music list on your phone. But then randomly, you get a random zombie attack, and what happens is you have to run 10% faster for a full 2 minutes, or you lose all the supplies you've collected. You don't die, you just lose the supplies, and so the gamification aspect goes. But I think about the brilliant storytelling in this app that encourages me to get out and exercise. And you can walk instead of running, you just gotta walk 10% faster. But the crazy thing about apps like that, the crazy thing about the way we can apply new technologies to stories is that there's so many new stories that will be able to be told than ever before, and just through the creativity of people like you in the audience and folks who apply that passion to the new technologies. I look at things like that. I look at how writers and readers today can engage in ways we never imagined before. You would type a letter to a writer you loved. You would discover Guy Gavriel Kay's novel and quote that in a letter to an agent, but never imagine that you can sit together at a panel like this thanks to When Words Collide, or never imagine that he might retweet something that you tweeted, or never imagine that you can suddenly learn about kudzu from a colleague on a stage, or wonder about all the jokes we're going to make about toboggans and toques. And I did make the joke because when you said toque, I said that's something that happens in BC, but will be happening a lot more in Canada next year. The interactions we can have as writers with readers, and readers can have with writers, and we writers who love other writers and want to interact with them is incredibly powerful thanks to digital technology. But there's nothing like coming together at a place like this. There's nothing like sitting with these amazing colleagues that I'm sitting with. There's nothing like sitting in a room full of passionate readers and writers like I have the privilege of doing today. And what I like to say when I think about this conference is magic happens when words collide. When words collide, the reader and writer engage in a magical, wonderful, passionate, and beautiful dance. And thank you all for being a part of this dance.